The Assembly will now hear an address by His Excellency Xavier Bettel, Prime Minister, Minister of State, Minister for Communications and Media and Minister for Religious Affairs of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. I request protocol to escort His Excellency. I have great pleasure in welcoming His Excellency Xavier Bettel, Prime Minister, Minister of State, Minister for Communications and Media, and Minister for Religious Affairs of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. I invite him to address the Assembly.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, dear colleagues, at the outset I wish to align myself with the words of my colleague Charles Michel earlier on behalf of the European Union, because I'm part of a generation which has never known war, and we thought that war was relegated to the history books. However, my continent is now seeing war on its own soil, and our strength and our solidarity, our union, I believe, is our unity. I am proud, therefore, that the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg is contributing with its partners to the resolute action of the European Union to promote our shared values: human dignity, liberty, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and human rights. As Europeans, we commit decisively to defend these values, which are principles enshrined within the Charter of the United Nations, and to bolster multilateralism, working together with the United Nations at the heart of this. You have attributed the theme of your presidency to a watershed moment and the need to find transformative solutions to interlocking challenges. And we are indeed at a watershed for the world and for the United Nations. For almost 7 months now, a permanent member of the Security Council, the Russian Federation, has been waging a large-scale war of aggression against Ukraine, a sovereign neighbourly country, with the involvement of Belarus. And this unprovoked, unjustified war has, for many people, and perhaps in many other countries in the European continent, this has revived the fears of war. And we are once again beginning to ask ourselves, is this possible? Might it happen? Recent threats and measures announced by Moscow merely exacerbate this situation, and we categorically condemn them. We do have a situation here with the Russian veto and with a Security Council which is blocked, and that is difficult. The Secretary General has condemned the manifest violation of the Charter of the United Nations by Russia, and on the 16th of March, the International Court of Justice indicated precautionary measures requiring that the Russian Federation should immediately suspend military operations. And this Assembly also met in an extraordinary session and adopted 3 resolutions in this context. A great majority of the members of this Assembly condemned Russia's aggression against Ukraine and required and called that Russia should immediately cease fire. Upon the demand of President Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, I participated as Prime Minister in these efforts. I held interviews with the Russian president and the representatives of the Russian Federation here in this room as well, and I do not regret my attempts. I am disappointed regarding the result. When I hear President Erdogan, for example, saying that last week that perhaps we would see peace, and then the same day President Putin announced the organization of referendums. And we know how long that takes, and if we try to organize referendums during wartime, and we go to people's doors and ask them to put ballot papers into boxes, or however we organize it, it's impossible to organize referendums during circumstances such as those in existence today. I fear, indeed, Madam President, that this referendum is merely an excuse to justify further actions, to say that this is Russian territory and therefore Donbass must now be protected by Russia, thus justifying the even more brutal use of means than is currently happening, and I regret that. And my discussions with President Putin were an opportunity where I did appreciate the frankness and the discussions, but I do see that today starting a war seems to be easy, but the greatness of a political figure is marked by their abilities to end a war and to get out of it. And I do not know how President Putin can explain recent announcements and mobilizations, and explain recent demonstrations. How can we explain to mothers who are going to lose their children or women who are going to lose their spouses to participate in a war that has no sense? As a politician, I have not been at the head of my country for a number of years now, and I always try to find responses to the questions I ask myself. And this is the first time, representatives of the Russian Federation, that I cannot find a response. I cannot understand this. So once again, I launch a call to your president for a ceasefire and diplomacy. I launched appeals, but in the end I couldn't launch any more. I admit I didn't understand this, particularly having heard about members of the military who committed crimes. Saying that this is intolerable is not strong enough a word. This is intolerable. The war continues and has claimed 14,000 victims, civilian victims in Ukraine, including over 1,000 children. There are mass graves with people who have been slaughtered. I saw this in Bucha. There were summary executions. And every day is a day too many. And this also imperils Ukrainian nuclear plants, and many countries are afraid of that. This is an intolerable risk for Ukraine, but also for other European countries. And as I said, I went to Ukraine around 3 months ago, and I visited the cities of Borodyanka, Bucha, and Irpin. And I'm speaking about a personal experience here, but I met a woman who had lost everything. But she retained hope and a determination to believe in peace. She was there with her son, who had gone deaf as a result of the bombings. So I'm sorry, representatives of the Russian Federation, but we cannot. Nobody can condemn a country or a generation or kill innocent people. I cannot find the words to express this. And when I saw the atrocities committed by the Russian military forces, I could not but bow my head in the memory of children, innocent people whose lives were cut short by war. They had paid with their lives. I say this here, and I said this in Kiev as well, President. Ukraine can continue to count upon us to help them in defending their independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within their internationally recognized borders. And the right to legitimate defense as enshrined in Article 51 of the Charter. It is our responsibility to help Ukraine. We cannot accept a larger neighbor. And I admit this. I do not belong to one of the largest countries in terms of size or army. But I cannot imagine living in a country where I would have to worry about the action or inaction by my neighbors. And I think that one of the greatest achievements of my continent is the European Union. And if since then we've been living in peace, it's because we have managed to build something together. My country is between France and Germany, and at the Second World War they were enemy countries. Now we are partners and are building something together. I would not be here before you or be living in a democracy if countries which were not my neighbours but other countries had not helped me as a country. And as Luxembourg, we have also opened our doors to those fleeing war. These people do not want a better life, they just want to live. And we welcomed over 1,000 Ukrainian pupils into our schools. Whether this is in Kiev or at home in Luxembourg, the courage of these mothers, these families, these children, these men in Ukraine, they are starting to rebuild their country and breathe new life into their liberated towns after the barbarity visited upon them. And we must honor this courage by tirelessly supporting investigations carried out by national and international actors, and I'm thinking of the International Criminal Court, so that those responsible for crimes and war crimes and other crimes in Ukraine are identified, prosecuted and punished. There can be no impunity for war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide or the crime of aggression. And allow me to take this opportunity to applaud the courage in Russia. President Putin has called for a mobilization now, and there are young Russian people who are leaving their country. As Jean-Michel was saying earlier, we cannot talk about war without condemning it today. Is it too late? Perhaps it is too late. What has already happened is unforgivable. There must be a ceasefire. There must be a halt to the killing of innocents. And to the representatives of the Russian Federation, this is something that I hold very dear myself, and which is why I'm very sensitive to this topic. I have a grandmother who is Russian and a grandfather who was Polish. I have a Luxembourgish grandfather and a French grandmother, Orthodox and Jewish. One was an atheist, the other Catholic. And even in my country with Jewish blood and as a liberal and married to a man, I would be condemned to death in my own country. Let us accept differences and the wealth of diversity. Let us live in peace and no longer commit the same errors. And I launch an appeal to President Putin. Starting a war is not the difficult thing, as I said earlier, but stopping it is where true greatness lies. And this war began at a time when most of us were beginning to feel the relief of the end of the COVID pandemic. We thought that we would be able to move on, and now we are faced by issues of food security, particularly those in vulnerable situations in Africa and in the Middle East. And I repeat to our African colleagues, I know that there's a narrative saying that European sanctions are causing the problems and the food crisis, but this is false. It is the war, the aggression in Ukraine, which is responsible for the problems we are facing. And I should like to thank President Erdogan, who sat down at the table to try to find a way to get Ukrainian grain out of the Black Sea and the exports, and that is crucial for millions of people. We've seen an increase in energy prices, with repercussions which are extremely harsh for many Europeans as well. So it's easy to say that sanctions should be abandoned. I would like to see the war being abandoned. Not us, but you, our Russian colleagues. I would also like to welcome the initiative of the Secretary-General to bring together a response group for the food and energy and financing crises to identify short, medium and long-term solutions. And I should like to thank Antonio Guterres and his teams for their tireless efforts, as I was saying, regarding the agreement with Turkey. We also wish to support the World Food Programme, the FAO and the IFAD to strengthen food and nutritional resilience. The Sahel region is suffering from food insecurity, amplified further by climate change and the effects of the war in Ukraine. I was also recently in Niger, and I should like to express gratitude for the leadership of President Bazoum there. Niger is a cooperation partner country, and we are committing to bolster stability in the region. I also want to say I remember when I was with Mr. Roche, And leaders have changed since then. Stability in Africa is, I believe, crucial. And it's another crisis alongside others. I am proud, President, to be Prime Minister of a country which devotes 1% of its gross national income to official development assistance. And when we talk about public assistance, about official development assistance, there are countries, or citizens indeed, who might say, well, why do you help other people? There are problems at home. And I am proud that we devote 1% to help others. When some of the problems we face at home are minimal compared to those elsewhere. We also wish to contribute to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, and in order to do this, our partnership with Africa is crucial. And we intend to bolster this at continental level with the European Union and African Union and bilaterally. And this goes beyond conventional cooperation centered around social areas such as health or education. It also extends to renewable energy, combating climate change, as we are doing with our partners in Cape Verde, and in the fields of ICT. I was recently in Kigali, where we are continuing to develop such partnerships. If we wish to be credible partners, we must commit ourselves. We can all hold meetings about commitments, but we need to fulfill those commitments. There's no use in meeting to pledge something, then not do it. So with regard to climate financing, my country has decided to apply the principle of additionality. So our climate financing comes on top of our ODA. During the COP26 in Glasgow, I announced that the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg would increase its climate financing to 220 million euros over the 2021 to 25 period, and half of that will be used for adaptation to climate change in the most vulnerable countries. We also intend to invest increasing shares of this in innovative instruments to mobilize private financing instruments. We are European chef de file in the area of sustainable finance, and we are increasing the major role of private capital in order to move towards carbon neutrality. Along with the EIB, we are working on this in the field of sustainable finance. In the face of climate urgence, we are somewhat reticent. We wonder if perhaps we should or should not act. I've heard a number of speakers today. We're wondering about whether the temperatures will go up by 2 or 3 degrees and what the consequences may be. But there are countries who are asking themselves how long they will even exist. They may be removed from the map because of these increases in temperature. In Luxembourg, we have launched a Citizens' Council for the Climate, where citizens will meet together and come up with proposals. And we realize that our citizens' proposals are often more courageous than ours as politicians. So we must listen to them. This is an interesting experience. We're going to meet in Sharm el-Sheikh, many of us, and we must mobilize to steer a steady course towards the objective of 1.5 degrees Celsius, which we signed up to in Paris. It is only by achieving this objective that and by pooled efforts, that we will reduce the impact of climate change. Allow me to think of our friends in Pakistan here and what is happening in Pakistan, which has an impact on human rights as well, and particularly the rights of children, which is therefore one of the priorities of Luxembourg in the Human Rights Council. We commit in the Council also to promote gender equality, to combat discrimination, to the rule of law, to bolster civic spaces and combat impunity. I also wish to think about Mahsa Amini in Iran and what happened there. The morality police were deciding about the fate of a woman. Is it justifiable, President? And I said this last year as well, that according to where I was born, my rights differ. Depending on where I was born, if I'm a member of a certain religion, I have no rights. If I am of a differing political opinion, I lose my rights. If I'm of a different sexual orientation, I lose my rights, or even may be condemned to death. And if I'm a woman, I have fewer rights than a man. That is a reality today in 2022. So it is extremely important that we continue to hold these independent international commissions of inquiry with regard to the violations of human rights. And their work, unfortunately, is increasing across the world. We also are committed to ensuring our actions are commensurate with the responsibility conferred upon us by our election to the Human Rights Council for 2022 to 24. It is the first time we've had the honour of sitting in this council, and I take this opportunity to express my own warm gratitude and that of the Luxembourg government and my country for having placed this trust in us. As you said, President, we are at a watershed moment. We must address the threats we all face. War or climate deregulation, and we must find shared responses and work together. To those who say the UN is powerless, I would respond that the United Nations is whatever we make it. It all depends upon our own ambition and what we manage to do. We need to mobilize to find solutions, forge alliances and commitments which allow us to bolster multilateral cooperation. This spring, for example, Luxembourg had the honour, along with Bangladesh, of facilitating negotiations which resulted in the adoption by consensus of the first declaration on progress made towards the implementation of the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration. We also participated in efforts which allowed for the adoption by consensus of the Liechtenstein initiative on the veto. This establishes a permanent mandate for this Assembly to hold a debate if the veto is used in the Security Council. We have a system. The system is what it is, but let us make the best of it. We do need reforms of the Security Council. The United Nations can't be a dog whose bark is worse than its bite. We must have a UN that functions. This is a body. Remember why we're here. After the Second World War, we wanted to sit around a table to find solutions, to work together. The United Nations must not today be a place where a veto can block a desire to build something together. We therefore welcome the work underway to follow up on proposals made by the Secretary-General in his report. And the Transforming Education Summit was held a few days ago, where the decision was taken to create a UN Youth Office. It's very important to involve young people because the errors we make today will be paid for by them tomorrow. We must have the courage to realize that politics may just be about the next mandate, but above all, it's about what we leave to future generations. So, President, I can assure you that Luxembourg will continue to serve the United Nations to champion our shared values, the values of humanity. This is why Luxembourg is also a candidate to the Security Council for 2031 to 32, and why we'll continue to work for peace and security in Ukraine, Mali, and the Middle East, which is why we continue to commit to uphold the rights of all human beings and humanitarian action for the people of Sahel, Syria. And we also step up when it comes to defending the Charter of the United Nations. Thank you very much for listening, Madam President, and I hope that next year, when we come here, the current atrocities in Ukraine will be part of history. Thank you.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the Prime Minister, Minister of State, Minister for Communications and Media, and Minister for Religious Affairs of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg for the statement just made. And I request protocol to escort His Excellency.